Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. I run a style MS 661 CM with a 36-inch bar because the old-growth stumps up here shrug off anything smaller. It's heavy, reliable, and familiar. The throttle burble and chain chatter tell me more about the wood than any meter. That morning, the saw felt normal. The fog hung low over the ridge like a gray tarp, beads of water gathering on the visor of my helmet. The redwoods along the spur road looked like they always did. Towering columns banded with sword ferns and shelf fungus, duff so deep your boots sink and cough up a sweet cold smell of old rain. I was thinking about how many tanks of mix we'd burn before lunch and whether the loader would keep up with the yarder. And then Walt changed everything by biting Marco on the arm. We were east of Outbreak, California, on a private tract off Bald Hills Road, an hour above the coast if the roads behaved and if the logging trucks ahead of you didn't stop to chain up. You don't cut inside Redwood National and State Parks, but timberland rings the park like a horseshoe, and there are outfits that keep to the sales and do clean work. Ours was small, Halverson timber, 7 regulars with a rotating cast of drivers, mechanics, and a cook when the road was good. A bunkhouse of 4 rooms and a common area perched on the edge of an old landing the rain had carved into a scalloped bowl. We had a Medial swing yarder set on cribbing at the rim, a link belt loader, a Caterpillar skidder that the mechanic swore had a personality, and a battered crew truck with a dog-eared first aid kit under the back seat. Radios on our vests crackled on the company VHF channel when we could hit the repeater on the far ridge. Cell phones were dead weight, except on the rare, clear, dry days when the salt air backed out of the canyons and the sky opened like a lid. I was bucking on the lower slope, trimming and sectioning what Liam and I had dropped before break. Marco was dragging chokers, chest steaming, the tail of his Dayglow vest shredded from catching on a root wad. Walt had been quiet all week. Walt was an old chaser with a permanent squint from years without safety glasses and a left knee that didn't like stairs. He'd been nursing a headache the night before, leaning in the doorway of the bunkhouse while Maya stirred a pot of stew on the camp stove and the generator hummed. We told him to drink water and sleep. At first light he came out glassy but said he was fine. Now he was standing too close to Marco, so close the arc of the chain threw rain on both of them when I sighted my next cut. "Back up, Walt," I called, taking my finger off the throttle. "You're crowding." The yarder horn blew one long, and I looked uphill toward the skyline. The carriage hung still in the fog between the trees, a steel beetle on a tight wire, and the horn's echo rolled down the gully and got caught in the ferns. One long means hold. I set the saw down, chain brake on, and walked up a few steps to see what was wrong. Walt reached out and put his hand on Marco's arm. It should have been nothing. We steady each other on slopes all day. There's trust in a hand on an elbow. But Walt's grip tightened. A slow twist, and his head dipped, not like he was going to say something, but like he was smelling something. Marco laughed and told him to get off before he fell, and then Walt leaned in and sank his teeth into the meat of Marco's forearm, right above the cuff of his glove, and clamped down. There wasn't blood like in the movies, at least not right away. There was shock. Marco shouted, a sound that started at surprise and turned into pain, and I was moving without thinking, shoulder down, knocking Walt off. The two of them slid on their butts and plowed ferns and duff. The chain brake on my saw ticked as the chain cooled, and the yarder horn blew twice short. Someone else had seen. "What are you doing?" I yelled, but Walt didn't answer. He looked as if he'd forgotten language. His mouth worked around the bite like it wanted more. He hissed, not a cat hiss, not breath through teeth, something deep like steam out of a pinhole, and pushed up on his palms. Marco sucked air and cradled his arm. The bite marks were white crescents, shallow and ugly, and then blood finally welled up. Tara, our mechanic, EMT by training, came skidding down the slope, her dark braid sticking to her neck. She didn't say anything to Walt. She went straight to Marco, tore open a foil packet with her teeth and pressed gauze to the wound, then wrapped, calm and tight. The rest of the crew was gathering behind the ferns. Liam with his saw idling, Ty with a peavey hooked to his belt, Big Joe in his loader jacket, breath like smoke. "Walt," Rick Halverson said, voice hard, "get back. What's wrong with you?" Walt made that hiss again and twitched like a guy who's about to sneeze. Then he turned and scrambled uphill, hands and feet like he'd forgotten how to stand. If there had been a better radio day, if the repeater had been awake, if the road hadn't already sloughed off in 2 places during the storm last night, we would have called down to town for a truck and a test and an explanation. But it was one of those thick mornings when sound goes sideways, when a chainsaw sounds farther away than it is, and voices feel like they're underwater. The handhelds on our vests were dead quiet, except for static pips and a high hiss like wind in a bottle. "What was that?" Joe asked. He had big hands that looked even bigger empty. "Marco's going to the truck," Tara said, already helping him to his feet. "Keep pressure. Don't touch the wrappings." "Hold up," I said. "What about Walt?" "He doesn't want to stay," Liam said, untying a wedge from his lanyard and sliding it into his pocket. The edge of his visor dripped. "Maybe he's sick." "Yeah," Ty said, "sick and biting people." "You're not helping," Tara snapped. She had that tone that makes a crew shut up, and it worked, even on Ty. "Get me clean water, not the jug, bottled." I ran the path down to the landing and grabbed what she wanted from the chest, then jogged back with the bottles clacking together. From the landing, you can see out, and what I saw was the slate line of fog layered over the coast and the way the ridge roads looked like they had been chewed. The main spur back toward Bald Hills Road was now 2 ruts and a memory in one section. A corner gone with the rain, the dirt peeled away to the old culvert like a rib. The creek below had gone from ribbon to rope overnight, brown and loud, throwing small logs against big rocks and then letting them go. Our crew truck had gotten in before dawn only because Rick knows every rut by feel, but going out already looked like a maybe. Tara cleaned the bite with steady hands. Marco sat stoic and pale and tried to breathe through his nose like she told him. Walt was gone. He'd vanished uphill into the ferns and the red stems of huckleberry and the big cedar roots that arc like knots of iron. We called and got nothing back but the odd yip of a hidden bird and the sound of the creek. "All right," Rick said. "We're done for the day. Pack it in. Tara, get Marco to the bunkhouse. See what we've got. The rest of you, shut the machines down and button them up. I'll see if the road will let us by." "Radio first," I said. "If the repeater's asleep, maybe the tower on the ridge is still up." Rick nodded and touched the PTT on his vest mic. He tried the company channel, then the USFS channel we keep in the second bank for emergencies, then old logging channels nobody uses anymore. All I heard was that same bottle hiss. It's funny what you remember. I recall the exact weight of my saw when I lifted it that day, the way the rain had changed the balance because my gloves were wet, the chill that penetrated the foam of the ear pads and ran down the side of my neck. I remember how the ferns looked up close, each leaflet beaded in a perfect row, and how behind those tiny mirrors the woods were watching. I remember thinking, we're alone up here, and then trying hard to think, we've been alone here before, and we know how to be alone. But the first thought kept pushing. When we got Marco inside the bunkhouse, Maya already had a pot of water heating and the first aid kit unsnapped. She had been the last to join the outfit and the first to build order from chaos. She fed us like an army with 2 burners and a temper so gentle you didn't see it until it turned into steel. She took one look at the way Tara held Marco's arm and moved the table away from the wall so Tara would have light. "I can take stitches," Maya said, "but that's beyond me." "How deep?" "Shallow," Tara said, "but ragged. That's worse than it looks." "Let me," Maya said, meaning the water. She set out iodine, gloves, gauze in neat little rows. The order helped. It always does. We argued about Walt. That's the word for it, even if we kept our voices like we always do inside. Ty wanted to go after him immediately. Liam said we should wait until the fog lifted, because you can lose a grown man 6 feet away in that stuff. Joe said he'd go with a radio and a rope. Rick kept shaking his head, not a no, but a way to keep his thoughts aligned so they didn't spill. He had a daughter in McKinleyville and a wife who worked nights at the Safeway, and if I say he looked like a man trying not to think about them, I say it because that's what I saw. We decided to wait an hour and then sweep in pairs, flagging as we went. We ate, though nobody wanted to. Marco sipped water and set his jaw. The bite looked wrong, not just from the teeth. The skin around it had flushed unevenly, like a map of islands just under the surface, and when Tara touched there, Marco shivered and his eyes unfocused for a second too long. She asked his name like you do after a knock to the head, and he said it, and then he said the date. He got it right on the second try. "Take it easy, brother," I told him. "We'll get you down after the sweep. Rick can make the corner if anyone can." "We shouldn't wait," Ty said. He kept glancing at the door like it owed him an answer. "We get him in the crew truck now and go." "Go where?" Rick asked. "Redwood Creek is high. The culvert at mile 2 is gone. We'll need to lay logs to cross, and I don't want to be on it when one gives. We do this in order." He was right. The rain the night before had come in waves. Atmospheric river, the radio had said when it still said anything. A lot of words to say the sky had openings where ocean poured through. The coast had taken it first, but the canyons always double the trouble. Roads up here are scars across steep ground, stitched patches, promises. One rain like the night before and promises break. At 50 minutes, I took my radio and teamed with Liam. We flagged orange from the landing up toward where Walt had been last seen. The fog had thinned, but patches still clung to low spots and hollows where it chilled your shins. Liam's saw hung from his hand without his usual bounce. He's a man who sings to his saw, just half a line you can't hear, and the quiet made me itch. We found nothing but our marks and the drag paths of chokers and one glove that didn't belong to any of us. It was a mechanic's glove, pale where oil had bleached it, and inside it was damp with something that smelled wrong. We left it where it lay. We were up near a line of wind throw from 2 winters back when the howling started. At first, I thought it was coyotes. You hear them in the redwoods sometimes, their voices pinging through the trunks like silvered bells, a sound both close and far. But this was heavier, deeper, like a whistle through a giant's knuckles. The yarder horn on the landing imagines it knows how to carry, but this sound carried farther and found you better. Liam raised his head and met my eyes. We stood still and listened. "It's the canyon," he said. "Wind in the cut." "Wind doesn't sound hungry," I said without meaning to. We both smiled because it was such a thing to say when you're trying to be rational, and then we didn't smile because it didn't feel wrong to say it. We turned back. Rick had decided to hold for the afternoon and try for the road at the first light when the creek might drop. Tara had changed Marco's bandage twice. His skin had gone the color of the mist outside, and his eyes had picked up a shine that made me think of there being ice in a person. In every crew there is a moment when the leader says something nobody wants, and this is how it came out. "We'll use the loader in the deck," Rick said. "We'll stack a barrier on the landing edge and drag logs into a wall around the bunkhouse. We'll leave a lane for the truck, wide enough to swing. Ty, lay out chain and chokers like trip lines. Joe, fuel everything and get the light towers working. Maya, boil more water. Liam, Evan, you're with me cutting posts. We'll brace the doors tonight with wedges. We move fuel and food inside before dark." "Are we expecting a party?" Ty asked, halfway to a joke and halfway not. "We're expecting to be ready," Rick said. "Radio still dead?" Tara shook her head. Same hiss. I made the emergency call on the USFS channel, no reply. Might be the Ridge repeater is down too. "What about that Garmin thing?" Joe asked. Maya lifted a small orange device from the shelf. A satellite messenger, the kind backpackers carry when they can't afford to lose their way. "I don't have a subscription," she said. "I brought it because I thought it would make me feel better." "Let me try," Tara said. She set it where the skylight could see a strip of gray. The little indicator blinked and thought, and then blinked again. A patient metronome that seemed to nod at us in apology. If we had been asked to build a defensive ring in a redwood camp on a fogged-in day with shallow soil and a creek that sulked and pounded by turns, we would have made something like what we built. Joe used the loader to lift rounds and lay them 3 deep along the landing edge, pinning them with chain and cleats like a crib wall. We didn't cut living giants. We cut what we had cut already, the sections stacked for trucks that would not be coming. There's a way to stack logs that looks like art if you are not a logger and looks like sense if you are. We left narrow entrances, each with a sawed-off stump rolled across like a doorstop. Ty laid chokers knee-high with hooks pointed out, the steel cable just slack enough to trip a boot. He set 2 salvaged bear bells from the cook trailer on the line so anything that went through would sing. Inside the ring, we made order. Fuel on one side, food on the other. Fire extinguishers at each corner. The 2 portable light towers, diesel humming. Tall masts lifting their rectangles of LEDs. Everything that could be tied was tied, and everything that could scratch was covered. It looked like a camp that had turned in on itself without panic. By late afternoon, the fog had changed from a mat to a curtain, kinetic, pulling apart in shreds that let you glimpse the other world. The howling lifted again, now from 2 directions at once. I told myself that meant 2 coyotes, then 3, then 4, each talking to the other, echoing within the trunks the way sound will in a cathedral. We cooked rice and beans and ate standing up. Tara dosed Marco with what we had for pain and fever. Careful, measured, and his sweating steadied for a while. He started to tell a story about the first time he'd run chokers out here. A rookie, wrong boots, half his day teaching his feet where not to be. Mid-sentence, he closed his eyes and swayed, and would have gone down if Joe hadn't been standing that close. We got him to a bunk and shut the door quietly. On the dresser in that room was a postcard of the steel bridge at Fernbridge, the old one with its arches over the Eel River, and I thought of floods and the way a river decides sometimes to rearrange a county. Night is different in the redwoods than anywhere else I've worked. It's not just dark, it's awake. The trees keep their own time, and when you lie in your bunk listening to the fog drip and the creek talk, you can believe they are speaking to one another in a language that uses pressure and scent and the softest tick. The human sounds, then, are intrusions. The generator hum, the occasional clocked step from someone turning in a bunk, the radio hiss that reminds you of ocean. That night, the new intrusion started just after 10. At first, it was footfalls outside the ring. Not hurried, testing. You can tell if it's a person or a deer pretty quickly. Deer have lightness at the end of each step, a perfect economy. People put weight down and think about where it goes next. These were people. Joe was at the window and raised a hand, palm down, and every conversation died mid-word. He lifted his chin toward the door. Rick nodded once, and we moved like we had practiced when we never believed we would need it. The wedges we had cut were the size of engine heads and fit the jams like they were grown there. You swing them into place with a sledge, not hard enough to split anything, just hard enough to seat, and the door takes on a new sound when you touch it, a drum made of promise. The footfalls multiplied. One set became 3, became 6. Then the bells we had hung along Ty's trip lines gave a gentle, cheerful ring, and the footfalls stopped. There was a pause long enough for me to see my own breath and think about how I wanted it to be coyotes that had learned to walk upright. Then something tested the logs. Not a charge, a press with hands. A bored cat pushing a glass off a counter. Joe leaned closer to the window, breath ghosting the glass. "Don't," I whispered, "because you can become a reflection too easily, and some things aim for reflections." Joe nodded and slid sideways along the wall. When the first one showed his face, I stopped calling any of them they. I had names for them that never left my head because I knew better, even then. He was a man we'd seen once at the gas station in Auric, the one near the sign with the elk. He had a trucker's cap and the kind of beard that shows where a man has been, and he had always looked at Maya just a little too long when we stopped there for coffee. That night he looked at nothing. His eyes had shifted to the glaze I'd seen beginning in Marco. He pressed his fingers against the bark and left streaks that my mind refused to name as anything but mud. He put his mouth against the wood like he was listening with his teeth. Behind him, 2 others mapped the same pattern, a patient geometry that said, "We will learn this." We held. I'm not ashamed to say I was afraid. I'm not ashamed to say I wanted to speak and couldn't find the place in my throat where voice begins. Rick tapped my arm and gave a tiny nod that meant, "We're here." That's all it meant, and that's all I needed. At midnight, the howling rose, and this time I knew it wasn't coyotes. There is something in a human throat that can make a note animals won't choose, a long rising line that breaks and reforms, a sound half beckon and half beacon. It reached into the clear space above the landing and went looking for more of itself. Elsewhere in the woods, answers rose. I tried to count and stopped at 10. They were not close. Not yet. They were telling each other a story about a hill they had not walked. We made it through to what the clock called morning, which in the redwoods sometimes arrives as a lightening of the fog rather than a sunrise. The creek had flattened its tone a little, a hopeful sign, and the wind had shifted just enough that the yarder skyline sang at a lower pitch. We drank coffee that had been on the stove too long and tasted like the pot. Rick said we'd try the road at 9, after one more sweep and one more reinforcement. Maya put vitamin packets in our mugs and stood on a stool to close the skylight just in case. So, the sweep was Liam and me again, because we knew the route, and because we were the 2 who didn't argue when Rick said the word pairs, like it was not going to have any exceptions. We went out the front gate. If you can call a log, you can roll a gate, and stepped into a world that had drawn a new map without telling us. Our flagged line was still there. Our tracks were gone. New tracks had come and gone in the wet duff. Bare feet, most of them, though here and there I saw a boot scuff, and that sent a cold line down my back. We found Walt within a quarter mile, curled on his side in an old culvert, arms tucked in like a kid sleeping. At first, we thought he was dead. His chest moved too shallow and too slow for my eyes. Then he opened his eyes and saw us, and we saw him. And what I saw was a man inside a man, looking out from far back. He tried to speak and made a sound like a mule deer that has been spooked. He appraised us like branches appraise wind. He lifted his hand and put 2 fingers to his mouth, as if reminding it of what it knew. Liam took a step toward him, and I touched his sleeve. "Walt," I said, "it's Evan. We're going to help you." He blinked. The second man inside blinked too. Something like recognition surfaced and then slid away. The radio at my shoulder gave one soft click, a noise a radio makes when it thinks about being a radio. Then it hissed and coughed and spat a syllable that could have been a call sign or could have been the canyon's echo of a cough. Liam squeezed his mic and said Rick's name twice. No answer. "We get him," Liam said. "We get him," I said, and we did, each taking an arm and easing him out of the culvert. He smelled of wet cloth and iron and a little of the mud that pools in places where water keeps a secret. He walked, but not like a man walks who puts one foot in front of the other. His feet sat down, then his body followed, a fraction late. When we reached the gate, Joe and Ty were already there to help lift, and Maya had the door propped and the table cleared and the kettle going for more hot water before we said a word. Tara worked on Walt with the same professional gentleness she had given Marco. She cleaned him without flinching when he made a sound low in his chest that never belonged in a chest. She asked him his name twice and accepted the way he answered like he was hearing her from underwater. She put a hand on his forehead and then put the back of her hand there. She looked at me and shook her head once. I wanted the shake to mean no fever. It meant too much. We had a plan to move at 9, and then the road itself stood up and said no, without pride or malice. It did that by giving way where it had looked sound, by letting the earth below become jelly. Joe drove the crew truck out first, up the ramp, across the landing. Headlights on because we told ourselves that would help, and when he reached the corner where the culvert had been before, the rain took its steel ribs and rolled them like toys. The ground dipped like a curtsy and the truck's right front wheel slid into an angle no wheel likes. He stopped before the slide could become a tumble and breathed the way men breathe when they see several futures at once and choose the one where they still get out. He backed up slow, a foot at a time, and the road slumped another inch like a tired animal. "All right," Rick said, after he walked the line, after he stood still and looked at the slope and the grain of the soil, and the dark mark where water had cut and undercut. "We stay put. We can put logs across this, but not like it is. We'll need a crib, and we don't have time today. We conserve fuel. We manage food. We keep Marco and Walt quiet and warm." He did not add, "and safe." The word hovered anyway. Noon brought a break in the fog. The sky went a lighter gray, not blue, but the kind of gray blue wants to become. We took turns on the roof with the satellite messenger, waving it like a flag to persuade geometry. It blinked its apology a little faster. The radio gave us another click and a spit, and then blessed silence. The howling did not repeat in daylight. The footfalls we had heard in the night had left patterns at the edge of the barrier, fingers drawn through wet moss, heel prints pressing and then dragging, as if deciding. We added 2 more logs to the wall for our own deciding. At 2, Maya called me from the doorway with a look on her face I will never forget, because it was 3 looks at once. Concentration, compassion, and resolve. "Evan," she said, "I need you." I followed her down the hall to the last room. Walt lay on the bed, breathing shallow. Marco lay on the other side, turned toward the wall, his bandage clean because Maya and Tara had kept it clean twice, 3 times, steady as a metronome. But it wasn't the bandage that had called me in. It was Marco's hand. He had pressed his fingertips against the wall and left 5 soft, damp marks like the petals of a flower. They were arranged in a way fingers never naturally arrange, unless the hand's owner has begun to forget the shape of his own hand. He had pressed his mouth to the wall too, like he could drink structure. Where his lips kissed paint, the paint had taken a darker color. "Talk to him," Tara said. "He hears you still, I can tell." I sat on the edge of the bed and told Marco the story he had started to tell me, the one about his first day and the boots that were wrong. I told it like I had been there, borrowing details from the way his hands had shaped the air. He smiled once, a thin line across his face that said someplace else, and for a second here. He said my name the way you say a thing you can hang on to during a flood. I told him we were going to get him out, that the road would let us by soon, that folks down the hill were already working on it, even if we couldn't hear them yet. He said, "Okay," and made the word 3 syllables, and then he slept with his eyes 2/3 closed like a cat. Around 4, the wind kicked up, and the skyline above the yarders started to sing in earnest. It's a sound you learn to ignore or you go crazy. A high nee-nee-nee as the cable saws the air. That afternoon the note escaped the realm of annoying and crossed into hungry again. The howling wrote it, not from the woods, but from the wire itself, as if the cable had learned a new mode. Ty went out to the landing with ear protection and a face that said he didn't believe in bad omens, but was willing to be convinced. He cinched another guy line, checked the clamps with a wrench, and came back in shaking his head like the act of tightening had made nothing better. We turned the light towers on early. Light does 2 things at once. It comforts the people who are inside it, and it paints the people who are thinking of coming toward it. I am not sure which effect is stronger. At dusk, we heard the truck before we saw it. A diesel cough on the far side of the slide, down the road toward the highway. At first, we thought rescue, and then we thought someone else trying to get out. We ran to the edge of the compromised corner as far as we dared and waved and shouted. The engine idled, then revved, then idled again, and the sound came closer until we could see the cab nosing up the opposite side of the washed corner, a double-axle Kenworth with a lowboy. The driver had his window down and his arm out and his eyes forward. He did not look at us. His skin had the ice gloss. In the passenger seat, a woman slumped with her cheek against the glass in a way most skulls do not like. The trailer was empty. The cab rolled closer. The driver put the truck in neutral and stepped out without setting the brake. "Stop!" I yelled. "Set it! Set!" The word brake had no place to go. The truck rocked and slid, and if a thing that big can also be slow, this one was slow. A gradual iron inevitability. It slid into the cut and came to rest at an angle, nose down, tail cattywampus, resting on a shelf of luck. The driver walked toward us across the broken ground, feet precise, hands out in front of him like a person feeling for a wall in a dark room. Ty picked up his peavey, and Joe swore, and then didn't because he remembered YouTube and the rules, and the way words can shape a thing for bad. He said, "No, friend," instead, and held out open hands. The driver kept coming, and when he reached the compromise between what we call this side and that side, he stepped into air like it was a floor and dropped 6 feet onto clay that grabbed and held. We didn't climb down, we didn't reach out. We watched because some things have to write the words themselves before you pick up the pen. When he hit, he rolled once and came up in that not-quite way, and then he discovered the edge of our world with his shins and stopped, as if a dog's invisible fence had given him a suggestion. He pressed his fingers into the dirt and traced patterns that were the same as the ones we had seen at the logs. He made his throat a horn and called, and beyond him, down in the trees, we heard an answer. Rick said, "Back inside," and for once, nobody thought to say but. Night 2 was worse. The bells went off 3 times and then fell silent after a sound like a bell being held by a careful hand. Something with patience was mapping push points. The light towers attracted moths and drew a soft barrier of flit and dust against the windows. Every time a wing tapped glass, you learned the difference between that small tick and the pat of a palm. We didn't sleep, not truly. We did a rotation that had names on a clipboard, 2 hours each, 2 at the window, 2 with the radio, 2 on the floor near the boys. Maya slept in a chair with a blanket and a wool cap pulled down over her ears. She woke when Tara asked and slept in between with the discipline of a nurse. Whenever my turn in the chair came, I felt my body fold and my mind sharpen in one direction: the sounds outside. Just before morning, the howling spread in a line that ran from north to south. It made me think of the Highway 101 corridor, that bright line of red on a map that means traffic, but should sometimes mean flight. If sound can mark a road, that's what it did. Painted an invisible route through the trees, marked like a skyline, and every few heartbeats someone in that moving line tapped their throat to keep formation. On the third day, the satellite messenger woke up. It did it without applause. Maya set it on the table, and when she passed by, the tiny screen had words on it that had not been there the second before. She called us all to look with a whisper so intense it bent the air around it. It said, "Service limited. Outage regional. Stay sheltered." A second, shorter line followed. "CDC alert, avoid bites." There was a link. The link was a mockery to people without a connection. A gossamer rope across a canyon. But the fact of the words was a bridge I could cross without feet. It wasn't just us. It wasn't just Walt tasting the world like he had never seen it. It wasn't just the repeaters asleep or the road gone. The country had changed while we were in the woods and had not had the courtesy to tell us in person. We talked about what to do with our new information and found that it changed nothing important and everything else. It gave shape to a danger that had been amorphous, worse by definition because we could not name it. We agreed in 3 minutes what had taken us hours before. We would fortify again. We would set more lines inside lines. We would make the bunkhouse a citadel and the landing a screen. We would ration fuel and water and food and attention. We would take turns telling our own minds a story that ended with daylight. That afternoon we built rigging we had no business building. We turned the skyline cable into a messenger line that could carry a crate between our wall and a second line of logs we laid 20 yards out. A false gate. We did it because Ty said he could make it, and because Joe nodded in a way that meant not maybe, but done. We strung a high line with pulleys and a hand winch, anchored to stumps cut so clean they looked like museum pieces. We loaded the crate with noisy things, pots, a metal bucket of bolts, a chain on chain, then loaded out and let it hang where the wind could speak through it. It would sing if someone touched it. A wind chime for work boots. As we finished the knots, someone in the woods began to clap. Slow, deliberate. The sound of 2 hands that had learned how to make each other into a noise. Clap, clap, a pause. Clap. It echoed in a way that said more than one person was clapping, out of sync, not in applause, in rehearsal. Rick's mouth tightened, and he walked the length of our wall, and then walked it again. By evening, Marco's fever had broken and then come back in a wave that left him cooler but hollow. Walt had stopped trying to stand. The shine was full in both of their eyes now, a glaze that looked like lake water at night. We spoke to them because speaking was a duty and because sometimes the lake remembers a voice and returns it as a ripple. On the 4th day, the creek had dropped enough that Rick thought we could lay a log across the gap at the corner of the road and at least get a man over to scout. He and I took a 30-inch round with flat faces and rolled it on skids to the edge. We moved with ropes and hands and a loader's finesse. When it sat where it needed to sit, slightly uphill, pinned with spikes through pre-drilled holes, we tested it one at a time, each step like a prayer. We crossed. The truck below sat at its same impossible angle, a monument to intention. The driver had wandered away. He had marked the clay with his hands and left. We followed the road around the next bend and found fresh slides and logs across the path that we had not dropped. The woods were doing what woods do: reclaim, rearrange, while we did what people do: fret and plan. Back at the camp, we heard the bells again. Not the first line. Those had stopped ringing when someone careful had wrapped them in cloth. The second line, closer. Our decoy crate chimed, then sang like a junkyard ballet. We took our places like people who have rehearsed for a play that will perform only once. The howling did not resume. The clapping did. There are things I could tell you in the next pages that would make you turn them faster, but that's not how it happened. It wasn't a single assault, a breach, and a brave stand with a tidy end. It was persistence on both sides. It was our wall becoming a habit for us and a puzzle for them. It was a week measured in fuel burned and bandages changed, and the particular fatigue that comes from listening more than moving. It was the way the woods themselves changed in our ears. Hoots that were owls became signals. Cracks that were branches breaking under their own weight became feet. The thump of a pine cone hitting the roof in the night became, for a moment before reason returned, a thrown rock. When the breach did come, it was almost quiet. The bells were gone. We'd removed them after we realized they taught more than they warned. The line between the first and second wall had filled with footprints the way a schoolyard fills with chalk. The loader sat with its bucket up, engine off, a dinosaur monument. We had set a plank bridge over our own trip line so we could go out and back without catching our boots. The plank was where they came. Someone had watched and learned and lifted the end of the plank and eased it over the cable and set it down again. The marks on the wood were neat and clean. The first man over wore a yellow rain jacket that made him look like a fisherman from a calendar. His hood shadowed his face, and he moved in that same post-decision way. Feet first, body second. He climbed the second wall by finding the knots the loader had left. He put a hand on the top log, then swung a leg and rolled. A gymnastic move learned in a life before. He landed on our side and stood up and turned and held his arms out as if to demonstrate and invite. 2 others followed. "Now," Rick said, and we did what we had drilled without wanting to admit it. We didn't rush the gate. We didn't run at them. We made the space smaller. Joe eased the loader forward and tipped the bucket. Liam and I slipped the wedges into the door braces hard enough that the wood thudded approval. Ty pulled the hand winch that moved our noisy crate in a line between walls. It sang and rattled and did the thing noises do to attention, drew it where we wanted it. The 3 men turned toward the sound and walked in that way toward it, like people who see a sign. The first reached the crate and put his hands on it and smiled without eyes. He lifted the lid completely off on the second try. He plunged his arms in and pulled out chains and bolts and a pot lid that clanged and pleased him in some old part of his head. The other 2 clapped, slow, delighted. We were behind the wall, watching through the window. I say delighted because that is a human word, and these were human people. The reason we survived long enough to tell this story is because we kept reminding ourselves of that even when fear wanted a different noun. They did not see the second line attached to the crate. Ty pulled again, harder, and the crate rolled on its small wheels. It would have rolled whether the man held it or not. He held it hard, and when it went, he went onto the cable line where the lower choker lay, and the hook caught him not in flesh but in clothing, and he fell, and the chain around his legs tangled with the hook like a polite handshake, and he was suddenly a part of the rigging and not a wild thing at all. He thrashed and made the horn in his throat again. The other 2 tried to help and became entangled themselves because they put their hands in loops without knowing the one thing every choker setter's hands know: where circles end. We did not climb out and finish them. We did not swing a thing and call it justice. We looked away when the line pulled and the crate moved, and the entanglement did what entanglements do if you don't think to stop them with a blade or a release. I say this to tell you what kind of people we were, and to be honest, about what kinds of things can save you that you do not intend as weapons. After that night, the howling moved further down the canyon. The clapping became occasional, and then sparse, and then gone. We waited a day, and then 2 before we believed what our ears said. We slept for 3 hours in a row and woke up guilty. The satellite messenger blinked every afternoon now with phrases we could use as stones to cross a river. Outages continue, shelter in place. Medical assistance delayed. The road dried enough that we could build the crib we had needed, and we did it with a focus that felt like prayer. Flat faces, squared corners, spikes driven with the echo of a church bell whenever the sledge found a sweet spot. When we rolled the log across and pinned it and tested it with weight, nobody applauded. We just breathed like people who had been underwater. We had a meeting then, in daylight, with coffee that didn't taste of the pot because the pot had been scrubbed by a person who believed in small salvations. We decided, because this is what you do, that we would leave in the morning if the creek would shake our hand and not pull us in. We would take the crew truck loaded with fuel and food, and the 2 sleeping men with shiny eyes and the 5 who could stand and lift and drive. We would go toward Outbreak and the highway because that is where people go when the woods close in, toward the line of asphalt and the ocean's edge, and the idea that the world beyond will take you in and make the rules make sense again. That night, the wolves that aren't wolves sang once in the far, far trees. A note that fell like a tired bird. An owl answered with its patient question. The cable sang its ee, and for the first time in days it sounded like a machine again and not like a throat. The bells on Ty's line, replaced, naked, honest, rang once when a deer, light as truth, stepped through and out again without touching anything at all. We left at first light. The truck didn't like the angle but took it slow and murmured back that it would try not to complain if we didn't. The road past the slide had peeled in 2 more places, but our crib held and our log carried, and after a mile a branch had fallen that we cleared with saws that sounded like work and not like fear. We passed a pullout where someone had scrawled a word on the back of a road sign with charcoal, safe, and under it, in a different hand, smaller, for now, we drove on. At the ridge above Redwood Creek, the fog opened and we saw the ocean catch light like a hen catching a coin. The highway lay ahead, a strip with fewer cars than a weekday deserves. A Coast Guard helicopter cut low over the water, windows glinting, and for a foolish second I lifted my hand and waved like a child. It went on toward Eureka without dipping a blade for us. When we reached Outbreak, it was quieter than fog. The elk that usually own the grassy stretch along the river had the place entirely to themselves, as if they had written a letter to the town and received permission to be infinite. A sign outside the store said closed in letters that announced that they were just for today and might be for forever. We saw 2 people, a couple from the looks of it by the way they moved near each other, walking down the center line with their hands up like they were balancing on the beam of the road. We did not stop, not because we lacked mercy, but because our mercy had to fit in a truck cab and a bunkhouse and 2 rooms that smelled like iodine and steel. We turned south because that is where the hospital is, and where the county has rooms with doors that lock and numbers on the doors that mean some kind of order. The satellite messenger blinked on the dashboard. It said, "Hospitals over capacity. Triage." We went anyway. We had Marco and Walt, and what you do with those 2 determines who you get to be. We decided we would arrive and tell the truth. where we'd been, what we'd heard, what we'd learned about trip lines and patience, and the way the woods themselves begin to speak a new language when people stop listening with the right part of their hearts. Before the junction at Trinidad, we pulled over in a turnout that looked west at the ocean and east at a wall of trees. We got out and leaned against the truck and breathed. A fishing boat cut north with its deckman a small statue against a big idea. The fog held back at the line of the beach like a dog told to stay. The woods looked like they always look, indifferent and attentive, ancient and new every minute. A coyote trotted across the exit road and turned its head and measured us in a way that let me see both the scale of what had happened and the tininess of our place in it. "Listen," Maya said, as we climbed back into the truck. We did. We heard gulls and a very distant siren in the creek that still finds its route no matter how many logs lie in its way. We did not hear howling. We did not hear clapping. We did not hear the cable sing. We heard our own breath, even and steady, and we took that as a sign, not that everything would be all right, but that we had survived the first verse of a song we did not ask for. I would like to tell you, we pulled into the hospital's lot and were met by a line of professionals with clipboards and masks and a protocol. I would like to tell you that we got a room for Marco and one for Walt, and that Tara wrote their names on the whiteboard in neat letters, and that everything after that was a waiting room lit by fluorescent lights and relief. The truth was stranger and more ordinary. The parking lot had a tent and a sign that said, "Triage" with arrows. A man in scrubs with a walkie that did work told us to pull around and wait. He asked if anyone in the truck had been bitten. We said yes, because our mouths were still disciplined. He looked at us from the far side of a 6-foot faith and asked us to wait longer. A woman with a clipboard took a picture of a wristband that had nobody's name on it, only a number. When they came with a gurney for Marco, we went with them until a chain on a post said no more, and then we stood with hats in our hands like men at an unfamiliar church. I don't have the end of this story because we are in it still. I can tell you the parts I know. We returned to the camp because it was ours, and because you don't leave fuel sitting in cans if you can help it, because a wall is a promise, but only if someone stands behind it. We took what the hospital could give, which was a word, Outbreak, and a series of instructions that were less real to us than the bells we could hang on a wire. We learned to talk to the satellite messenger like it was a person who sometimes answers and sometimes does not. We learned that work is a blessing when the world's new rules are written in wind on water. And the howling. It comes sometimes still, far off in the canyons, on a night when fog is a roof and the creek is speaking a language the ocean taught it. It threads itself through the trunks and past the light towers and rides the skyline until it reaches the landing and asks who lives here now. We answer with the low, steady sounds people make, hammers tapping wedges, a saw cleaned and hung, a kettle set down on the stove with a soft click. And with those sounds we say people, still here. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.